The best of Money Matters. The Big Story.
Welcome to The Big Story. I'm Hongbin Jeong. U.S. President Donald Trump has said the U.S. has no stronger partner than Saudi Arabia during his first major foreign trip. Mr. Trump is on a whirlwind visit of Gulf countries, mainly focused on shoring up investment. Speaking in Riyadh, the U.S. president pledged to lift all sanctions against Syria, saying it was now time for the country to move forward with a chance at greatness. Day one of the tour saw the U.S. and Saudi Arabia announce a $142 billion arms deal, as well as investments that the country's crown prince said could eventually be worth $1 trillion. Now, with so much emphasis on economic diplomacy and personal alliances, how far can Trump's approach go in reshaping Middle Eastern geopolitics? What are the long-term implications of re-engaging with countries like Syria? Well, joining us today to share more is Dr. Jessica Genauer, who is the senior lecturer in international relations at Flinders University. Hi, Dr. Genauer. Thank you so much for joining me again.
It's great to be on the program again. Thanks for having me.
All right, Doctor, what do you think the strategic significance is of Trump choosing Saudi Arabia as the first stop of his foreign tour during his second term?
So this is actually quite significant because obviously the president's first big international trip is one that there's going to be a lot of attention to, and it's going to say something about the direction of the presidency. So the fact that he's gone first and foremost to Saudi Arabia, and then he's going to United Arab Emirates and then Qatar, does say something about Trump's whole approach in his second term. And I think that this is about showing that Trump wants to prioritize economic deals and relationships, which is a lot the focus of this trip, over other types of foreign diplomacy.
Well, the visit included high-profile CEOs like Elon Musk and Sam Altman. What do you make of the integration of business leaders into this diplomatic trip?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's a really good point, which again underscores the fact that Trump is seeing this trip not so much about geopolitics, not so much about creating allies for the US around the world. It's really more about creating business relationships. And here we're seeing the whole way that Trump tends to view his role as a president almost as the head of a company. And he sees that it's his job to kind of make deals on an economic front, ensure that there is investment, financial investment coming back into US markets. And I think the fact that he took along some quite high-profile business leaders underscores this whole approach.
Okay, well, in 2021, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman struggled to get an audience with then-President Joe Biden. So how does Trump's warm relationship with the Crown Prince contrast with Biden's earlier pledge to treat Saudi Arabia as a pariah?
It's very much a sharp contrast with Biden's approach, but this is not so surprising when we think about how Donald Trump has come in very much with his own agenda, which even diverges from some more classic Republican approaches, not to mention the way in which it diverges from a Democratic president's approach. And I think that Trump has really leaned in to sort of doing things differently, doing things his own way, and actually is quite pleased in some ways to do things very differently to Joe Biden and to distinguish himself from the previous administration.
Well, Doctor, what does this say then about the role of, personal diplomacy in shaping U.S. foreign policy?
I think that we see with Donald Trump that really a personalization of foreign diplomacy really does characterize the whole way in which he conducts his diplomatic relations. So we can see how Donald Trump talked about Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. He was really referring to this as a very personal and warm relationship. And we've seen that time and again when Donald Trump talks to his counterparts. Either he really likes them or he doesn't really like them. And that seems to matter to him a lot. And I do think that at a personal level, he actually quite likes Mohammed bin Salman, thinks that they can get along together, and that they maybe have, in some ways, a similar approach towards some of those sort of economic aspects that he's trying to pursue.
Well, Mr. Trump described the U.S.-Saudi relationship as more powerful than ever before. Do you see any risks in this level of economic and political alignment?
I think there are some risks probably on both sides. I think on the Saudi side, if they get too close to the US or too close to the Trump administration and then something shifts in terms of, a wind change in terms of how the Trump administration operates in the Middle East, that could be risky and dangerous for them and could compromise other relationships, such as with China or other key actors around the world. I think from the US side, it's sort of politically a little bit risky for Trump. I think at the moment his core support base is viewing this whole trip very positively and would very much support it. But there could be other actors within the US domestic context, both on the Republican and the Democratic side, who would view getting too close to Saudi Arabia, who hasn't really been, traditionally they've been good relationships, but not sort of a close security ally necessarily, might view that with some concern.
Then could Trump's enthusiastic support for Saudi leadership create diplomatic friction with other allies globally?
I think that it could. I mean, we've again seen Trump, ever since he came in as president in the second term, really not hesitating to distance himself from traditional US allies. So we've seen this in regards to Europe and European countries, the way that he's sort of treated Ukraine, whereas, Joe Biden's administration was much more supportive of Ukraine. And we've seen it in the way he's treated traditional allies such as Canada, for example. So Trump is really not afraid to distance himself from more traditional partners, and I think he's trying to pursue less traditional partners, such as, those right now with the trip to the Gulf. So I think whilst it probably will create some friction with traditional allies, I'm not sure that Trump is really concerned about that or that something that would in any way change the way that he's going to operate.
Well, other than diplomatic friction here, will his strategic standing in the Middle East be able to, counter influence from countries like Iran, Russia, and China?
That's a really good question. And I think that Trump has come in saying that he wants to also restart negotiations with Iran. So he's sort of come in with an approach that, and he's certainly also reached out to Russia. With China, there's a little bit more tension. But I think he's sort of come in with this attitude that he does want to talk to various different counterparts. But I think that for countries in the Gulf, the way that Trump is reaching out at the moment is certainly very warmly and well received, but it won't stop them also trying to pursue other relationships, because they would know that they need to take care of their own interests as well, and they need to ensure that if there is any change in US policy further down the line, if one day there's another president who takes a different approach, they need to make sure that those long-standing, ongoing relationships with other countries still exist and would still be present.
Well, delving in deeper into President Trump's visit here, the U.S. has also agreed to sell Saudi Arabia an arms package worth nearly $142 billion. Now, a White House fact sheet called it the largest defense cooperation agreement Washington has ever done. So, Doctor, how significant is the $142 billion arms deal announced between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia?
So it is significant because we're looking at obviously not only a financial dimension, an economic dimension, but now we're looking at also this kind of defense security dimension. Now, there have been arms deals previously between the US and Saudi Arabia, so that in itself is not necessarily surprising. It's more the extent and the scope of this arms deal. We don't quite know yet exactly what is going to be in it. I think it's significant, but there still could be roadblocks and hurdles down the road if Congress decides to put in place limitations of what can ultimately be sold to Saudi Arabia. So a lot of the details still remains to be seen and will really determine how significant this is in the long term.
But do you foresee any potential risks of such military investment?
I mean, there can be a risk in that there's been some speculation whether the US will actually be giving Saudi Arabia new types of military equipment. So there could be risks there. I guess if we're looking at in terms of how the US relates not only to Saudi Arabia but to another key ally of theirs in the region, Israel. Obviously, Israel would not be very pleased if they see the US giving the same type of military technology that's going to Israel, giving that to Saudi Arabia as well. So there are sort of, I guess, various considerations there in terms of how this will all play out.
Would there be any drawbacks of the Trump administration's prioritizing trade deals over democratic values or past conflicts?
There certainly are risks here. So, of course, there's the ongoing war in Yemen, right on Saudi Arabia's border, and Saudi Arabia has been involved in that sort of for some time and undertook bombing campaigns in Yemen at certain points in time. So there can be sort of considerations and concerns around this. But I think that what we've seen with the Trump administration is that Trump has really come into his second term much more strongly taking a line that he is not going to be concerned about whether a country that he's dealing with has democratic values, whether they respect sort of civil and political rights. That's not going to be a key consideration for him. So he's actually distanced himself from some of the stronger sort of traditional democracies, liberal democracies around the world, and is getting closer to countries that maybe would be less considered in that category.
Right. Well, on top of this arms deal, U.S. President Trump has said he will, lift sanctions on Syria ahead of an expected meeting with its leader, Ahmed al-Shara. Now, the U.S. move comes after the U.K. and European Union lifted some, but not all, of their sanctions on Syria earlier this year. What do you think Trump might be pursuing by lifting sanctions on Syria and engaging with President Ahmed al-Shara's new government?
Yeah, I think this was one of the more interesting announcements that Trump made in Saudi Arabia, and certainly a surprise announcement. I think that what Trump is actually trying to do here is, in a way, to avoid the whole issue of the Israel-Hamas conflict while still addressing some kind of issues around the geopolitics of the region and showing that he's sort of giving something that will be very welcome to Saudi Arabia and very well received by Saudi Arabia. So obviously, Mohammed bin Salman and the Saudi Arabian domestic population would be very pleased to see these sanctions lifted on Syria. So Trump is kind of giving something in terms of showing, I guess, geopolitical goodwill, but at the same time avoiding and not addressing the ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas, which would obviously also be on the minds of domestic populations in Saudi Arabia.
Right. Well, at the same time then, how significant will this removal of sanctions be for the Syrian government and its people? Is it also a win for the Saudi Crown Prince?
It's definitely a win, I would say, for the Saudi Crown Prince in the domestic Saudi Arabian context. So I think the Saudi people would view this very positively and, would see that Mohammed bin Salman probably had some influence there in terms of maybe discussing this with Trump before the announcement. And I think this is really significant for Syria itself. It's very significant for the Syrian people. So with the new government that's come in Syria, it's come into a situation where, because of all the sanctions that were placed on the previous Assad regime, it's really crippled by sanctions from the start. So in order to operate economically, in order to engage in trade with other countries, in order to build up an economy, it's really critical that those sanctions are lifted. So we've seen celebrations in Syria on the street, people very happy and very pleased to see this announcement, and themselves saying that they really give a lot of credit for that to the Saudi Crown Prince. So that, again, is really putting him in a good light in the region.
Well, while it might be a big win for Syria here, wouldn't, Trump be conflicting with traditional U.S. foreign policy stances toward regimes with histories of human rights violations or links to terrorism?
So this is a really tricky one with the new Syrian regime that's come in, because whilst the leader, Ahmed al-Shara, did have previous links to some known terrorist groups, he himself is sort of claiming that he's now, taking really a different approach and wants to move into state governance and sort of statecraft in quite a different way. So it's a little bit of, I guess, to what extent do you trust and give a chance to the new Syrian regime, which is certainly quite different to Assad's regime, the previous regime, which did engage in very serious human rights violations, throughout the time that Assad was the leader of Syria, and in particular since the Syrian civil war. So do you trust the new regime? Do you try to give them a chance to build and grow and develop economically whilst they're trying to rebuild the country as well?
Well, how might this U.S. policy shift affect regional power dynamics, among Israel, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia as well?
So I think that right at the moment, while this visit is ongoing and there's a lot of attention to the current visit, we're seeing, for example, Israel probably not too pleased with some of the things that are happening, Turkey kind of looking on with interest. But I think that in the longer term, it won't necessarily be that significant, because the way that I view Trump's actions in the international sphere. So I think that Trump is very much motivated by what he views to be his interest and the interest of his core support base in the US on almost a moment-by-moment basis. So whilst right now he's pursuing very warm and friendly relations with Saudi Arabia, and I've no doubt that that will probably continue, but it doesn't mean that it indicates a more significant and deeper shift in this kind of whole geopolitical stance. I mean, I would say that Trump will still maintain close relationships with Israel. He would still be happy to visit Turkey at some stage or to have close relationships with President Erdogan. So I don't think that it necessarily constitutes a more strategic and deeper shift in the US approach.
Right. Well, Dr. Genauer, I also want to highlight this interesting investigative piece by CNN. It looks like, according to CNN, the Trump family's business ties to the Middle East have now more than tripled since the president's first term in office, from, luxury skyscrapers, golf courses to cryptocurrency. And the CNN tally of the deals has found a slew of new projects announced since he reclaimed the White House. What do we know about the Trump organization's current projects in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, and Oman, and how have these deals evolved since Trump's first term?
Yeah, so Trump, his sort of business entities do have quite extensive links in the Gulf region. So that's obviously something that has been a sort of an issue of concern and that people are paying close attention to. There are talks of building now possibly a Trump Tower, golf courses, cryptocurrency deals, so various types of business arrangements into the Gulf. And there are some questions being raised about whether, Trump going to the Gulf region, doing this kind of foreign diplomacy tour alongside key business leaders from the US, whilst he himself has such strong business interests in the region, is that okay, or should that actually be an issue for concern?
Well, we've spoken quite a bit about U.S. foreign policy here, but is Trump's business relationship in the Middle East a conflict of interest, maybe personal financial gain?
I think that it definitely is, and I think that if it was any other US president, that this would not really pass in the US domestic context. But because Trump kind of owns up to his sort of own businesses in quite a direct way, I mean, he doesn't say that that's the reason he's going, but on the other hand, I don't think that he would sort of be hesitant to admit that he has a whole lot of business interests in the Gulf. But the whole way that he's kind of approached the presidency in quite an unconventional way and hasn't necessarily had a lot of regard for the way that things have traditionally been done means that somehow he gets away with these things where I think that other presidents would not have.
Well, given this latest report, though, how credible are the Trump organization's claims that they do not conduct business with foreign governments?
I mean, without wanting to comment on specific claims that they've made, I would say that from all the evidence, it seems that there might be a bit of a grey area here, or there might be some grounds to question whether or not that is really the case.
Okay. And before we let you go here, Dr. Genauer, why might Gulf nations be eager to align themselves with Trump and his brand?
So this is actually really positive for Gulf countries. I mean, we can see that Mohammed bin Salman is really pleased. I mean, the US is still a massive operator internationally, both economically but also in terms of their military capability. And so it's very beneficial and advantageous for countries around the world, but also within the Gulf region, to be able to draw closer to the US, also within the particular politics of the Middle East region, where Saudi Arabia does have some regional tensions with countries like Iran, and then obviously there's also ongoing tensions between many countries in the region and Israel. The US is still a key player in the Middle East. They're still a very important country when it comes to Middle East matters. And so for countries in the Gulf to be able to say, we have close and warm ties with the US president is advantageous and beneficial.
Well, those are some great insights there. Thank you so much, Dr. Genauer, for joining me today.
You're welcome.
Thank you. That was Dr. Jessica Genauer, who is a senior lecturer in international relations at Flinders University. This has been The Big Story with me, Hongbin Jeong.
To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.